All right, so we're at time, so let's get going. So please, feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. We've got about 40 people in the room, and we will. So how this is going to work is, well, hi, my name is Eric. I am one of the co-founders of Sourhouse, and I'm happy to be joined today by Sourdough Brandon, one of our friends in the sourdough world, and the fellow who's kind enough to contribute the sourdough brioche recipe in our free Sourhouse community cookbook. And I have to admit, I'm a pretty mediocre brioche maker, but I love this, like the techniques of with the boiling the flour and so on that are used and how it can be applied in a lot of different ways. So I'm excited to learn today what we can figure out to make our brioche work better. So welcome, Brandon. Is there anything you want to say hello to the folks?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for joining, and I'm happy to get started here and hopefully give you some tips on how to make this awesome bread. It's one of my favorite breads to make for sure.
Awesome. So Brandon's gonna talk for, he's gonna walk us through the process for like 25 minutes or so. And then, as you get questions as they come up, put them in the chat. Try to use all caps if you can. That helps me as I kind of go through to identify what are the questions and what are the chats. And then after we get done with the walkthrough, we're going to take time and do a Q&A, and we'll run through all the questions people have. So I think that's it. We'll just jump right in. So Brandon, take it away.
Yeah, thank you again, Eric and Ginny, for hosting this event, and thank you everyone for showing up. And hopefully, like I said, we can make a really delicious brioche. It's one of my favorite breads to make, and I'm excited to kind of share this recipe with you. I'm a food blogger and sourdough recipe developer. I develop and recipe write everything here in my home kitchen in Western Massachusetts. So everything that you see, all the photos are right here at home that are on my website. So I come from an education background, just for a little bit about me. And so I try to make everything that I write as detailed as possible for other home bakers, because that's what I would like. When I'm baking, I want really exact ingredients and instructions, just so, especially with sourdough, so it comes out as good as it can be. So the website has various bread recipes, some sourdough discard recipes, and then I also have some guides on how to make sourdough. And I continue to add more and more to the website over time. So I use those detailed instructions and photos of the entire process, hopefully to make it easier for you. I think especially with sourdough, it's intimidating. Kind of as Eric was mentioning, like the first time you're making a loaf, it can be a little overwhelming. There's so many steps, or even just the lingo and the language can be overwhelming when you start. So I hope that the website can be a hub or a resource for you all. Okay, so here's a quick overview of what I'll be going over, which Eric kind of went over briefly. So we'll talk about exactly what is brioche. I'll go over the equipment that you'll need for this recipe, ingredients, and then we'll walk through step by step on how to make the recipe. Obviously, I can't make every single step here in the time that we have, but I have the dough in various forms here and hope to show you a few of the tips or techniques that I have when I'm making the bread. And then we'll save time at the end for the Q&A. So where can you find the recipe if you want to follow along? As Eric said, it's in the Sourhouse community cookbook. It's also on my website at sourdoughbrandon.com. So you can follow along if you want to there. So what is brioche? So I know that there's someone from France, so please don't clock me on my French, but brioche is a type of viennoiserie. It's a leavened baked good made typically with an enriched dough of eggs, sugar, milk, and butter. So this loaf has one full stick of butter in it. It's incredibly light, it's fluffy, it's really rich. And sometimes you'll see brioche as individual rolls. You can make it into buns, like hamburger buns. For this example, I kind of make it as one loaf. It can be braided. I've seen it almost like a challah braided in a loaf pan. So it can be shaped in different ways. I kind of do mine almost like a choco pan or a milk bread type recipe. I think it looks a little bit more whimsical, and I kind of like how there's straight sides and it gets really tall and fluffy and light. Of course, you can eat it alone. It can be great sandwich bread. It's super decadent. After a few days, if it starts to go stale, it also makes really great French toast, or Bostock or Bostock. It's also the foundation for many of my other recipes on the website. So I use a variation of it for cinnamon rolls and my dinner rolls. And there'll be more to come kind of with the brioche. And so I chose this recipe because I think someone mentioned, like, when we think about sourdough, we think of those like French country artisan style loaves that have really crunchy, crispy crust and, a custardy like interior. And of course that's delicious and so yummy to make and fun to make, but brioche is just completely different than that. But you can use your sourdough starter to make something completely different that's light, fluffy, pillowy, airy. And so that was one of the reasons why I chose to showcase this recipe, because I think it's just a different way to kind of show how you can make anything with sourdough. And if you know how to make brioche, it just kind of opens up the world to so many other great baked goods. All right, so the equipment that you'll need is pretty basic for this. So I use a baking scale. This one's the Ascali baking scale, if you can see. So I use this to weigh all of my ingredients by grams. If you start weighing your ingredients by grams and by weight, you'll just immediately become a much better baker than most people. This is really important, especially with sourdough, because if a recipe calls for, say in US terms, like half a cup of sourdough, that can weigh incredibly differently from person to person. Even a cup of flour weighs different depending on the type of flour that you use or how you measure it. So it's really important to measure by weight, and then all of my recipes are written that way. So then you know exactly, okay, this calls for X amount of flour. So if I measure by weight, I have the right amount of flour. It's not just a cup and like you may be off a little bit. So those little differences add up and make a really big difference. I also call for a bread loaf pan. So you can use a typical like 9x5 bread loaf pan for this recipe. I really like to use what's called a Pullman pan, and sometimes it has a lid to it so you could bake like square bread that looks kind of sandwich style. I don't use the lid for this recipe, but you can kind of see it has straight sides and it makes the dough rise really, really tall. So I really like the way that the bread looks in this. You can use a typical bread loaf pan, so you don't have to go out and like buy a really fancy pan. This one is by USA Pan, and it has like a natural non-stick coating on it. So it just plops right out of the pan. It's really easy to clean up. So I love this pan. You'll also need a pastry brush. So brioche, when you mix it, is extremely delicate. And at the end of proofing, you'll touch it and it feels like it's almost about to deflate. So a pastry brush is just a really gentle way to brush the egg wash on at the end. And the egg wash is what gives it the really golden, beautiful, shiny crust at the very end. And then lastly, I do recommend, if you have a stand mixer, to use a stand mixer for this recipe with the bread hook attachment. It makes mixing so much easier and it develops the gluten easier. So with the stand mixer, it mixes for about 10 minutes or so, which is a long time. There's so much butter and the enriched ingredients in this dough that developing gluten can be kind of hard. So whereas in sourdough, you can kind of mix by hand maybe, and like a sourdough bread, this bread has so many enriched ingredients that using the stand mixer just really, really helps the process. That being said, if you don't have one, you can definitely make this bread without a stand mixer. I know many people on my Instagram have made this bread without a stand mixer and they mix it by hand. One technique to use is the slap and fold technique. So I would mix everything in the bowl together and then just kind of slap and then fold the dough on the countertop. That really helps accelerate the gluten process, and those strands of gluten will start forming a little bit faster. So I mentioned it takes about 10 minutes to make this dough kind of mixed for enough gluten development in the stand mixer. If you're mixing by hand, it may take double the amount of time. It may take 20 minutes, but I'll go over the indicators. It'll be the same indicators either way you decide to mix it. So I know it's possible. It's just a little bit of elbow grease. All right, so for the ingredients that will be needed, you'll need an active sourdough starter. So I actually have mine right here in my Goldie in the background. So it's cold here in Western Massachusetts this time of year, and my kitchen stays in the like 62, 65 degree range. Actually, it's quite cold. So I keep mine in Goldie and it's at the perfect room temps, and I know exactly how fast or slow it's going to rise depending on how much I feed it. So you want an active and healthy sourdough starter for the recipe. This is a naturally leavened loaf. There's no active dry yeast or instant yeast in the recipe. I also recommend a high quality, high protein bread flour. So I really like to use King Arthur especially for recipe testing. It's widely available on the East Coast, but you could use another brand as well. That's just high quality, high protein bread flour. This will make the bread chewier. It will hold the height of the dough. And that's all really important for a dough like this that is so enriched that I said. You can use all-purpose flour as well, if that's all you have. So try to find a high-quality all-purpose flour. The King Arthur all-purpose flour would definitely work for this recipe as well. There's a little bit of sugar. I use fine ground sea salt. It mixes a little bit easier, incorporates a little bit more easily into the dough. Whole milk, a couple of eggs, plus the egg that you'll use to wash it at the top. And then 1 stick of unsalted butter. So 1 stick of butter in this brioche. So no wonder it's so good. Great. So the first step is to build your levain. So a levain is just an offshoot of a sourdough starter. I use this method all the time in all of my recipes because it lets you schedule a little bit more easily and it keeps it separated from your main starter. So I have my main starter, which is back there, that I feed consistently, 12 to 24 hours, just depending on my schedule every single day. The levain allows me to separate it from the starter, use a little bit of sourdough starter to make this separate levain. And for this recipe, it's a 1:1:1 ratio. So equal amounts of starter, flour, and water. For a levain, this recipe is just bread flour, so it's just a pretty simple levain or starter. So you could just use your sourdough starter if you wanted to for this recipe. You could use, it's 90 grams for your sourdough starter in the recipe instead of building a separate levain. But some recipes will call for different flours in your levain. So for example, in my spelt sourdough recipe, I use a little bit of spelt flour in the levain, and that just keeps it separate from the starter. And then the spelt isn't mixed in to your main starter. So I hope that makes sense and just kind of clarifies what the difference between the levain and the starter is. But you can definitely just use a plain sourdough starter in the recipe as well in equal amounts. If your starter is a little bit sour, or if you notice that you make this bread, or most of your breads that you make is really sour, it's probably pretty acidic. It's an acidic starter. It may need to be fed more often. It might be pretty hungry. For a loaf like this, I don't add any sugar or anything to the starter itself, but you can always add a few grams of sugar to your sourdough starter just to sweeten it up and make a sweet levain for a recipe such as this. So at this ratio, so equal parts starter, flour, and water, it ferments for about 5 hours until it's double in size, it's ripe, and it's healthy and happy. At the same time that you make your starter, or a little bit later in the process, you'll make something called a udine. So this is what is the magic trick, I think, to this recipe. And it's a Japanese method of mixing equal amounts of flour and boiling water together. And this gelatinizes the starches, pre-cooks the flour, and all together it allows for a higher hydration in this recipe. It makes the dough rise really tall. It also makes it last longer, so it's more shelf stable. And it gives you that pull apart, stringy texture that makes it look like a pillow or a cloud loaf. So this is so easy to make, and if you've used or kind of worked with, if you worked with flours or pre-cooked flour before, it's similar to tangjong, except that this method is just boiling water and flour equal parts, and I think it's a little bit easier. So that's why I use this method. So this is what it kind of looks like when it's mixed together. It doesn't look like much, but it makes all the difference in this loaf. So this is just equal parts flour and water together. I use boiling water from a kettle like I would for making a pour over coffee, and pour it over the flour and just mix it there. And you just let that set to the side, and then you'll add all of that into your dough a little bit later. So it's a really simple trick that I think makes all the difference in this loaf. So in your stand mixer, you'll mix the brioche dough next. So add all of the ingredients to the brioche dough except for the butter. So this is 212 grams of bread flour, 27 grams of sugar, 5 grams of salt, all of the levain, so about 90 grams of starter, all of the udane, and then 59 grams of whole milk and a couple of eggs to the bowl of the stand mixer. The dough will be pretty stiff and shaggy at the beginning when you start to mix it. If it's not coming together, just let it rest for 10 minutes. Sometimes the dough can just be covered and the gluten needs to relax for a few minutes to just kind of incorporate. But you'll mix it for a few minutes and then you will slowly add your butter into the dough. And this is kind of the main technique in typical brioche, is slowly adding butter in. So you want to use softened or room temperature butter, because if it's melted, the dough will be really greasy and it won't incorporate at all. So you'll just kind of have a greasy mess of a dough. But if it's too cold, the butter will just kind of break apart into a million pieces. So the brioche, the key is to really develop enough gluten with this room temperature softened butter that will incorporate in the dough, and you need to be able to mix it long enough that way. So I cut the stick of butter into little pieces, and I slowly add them and continue to mix the dough on medium speed for about a minute in between each addition. So this is how it takes so long to mix this dough. But while it's doing that, it's incorporating the butter and it's building all of this gluten so the dough can rise really tall. At the end, the dough will look somewhat like this. So here's the dough. It's really shiny, it's silky, it's not greasy. The dough will be tacky, not sticky. So you can put your finger on it and it won't stick to your finger like that. So that's kind of what it will look like. The dough will also pass what is called the window pane test. So this is the best test to know if your dough has developed enough gluten. So I'll show you a little bit here, if you can see. So the window pane test just tells you if enough gluten has been developed in your dough. And what you do is you just pull off a piece of your dough like this while you're mixing it. And if it tears immediately, then you know that it needs to be mixed a little bit longer. This dough has been sitting here for a little bit of time, so it did tear a little bit. But in general, you see the dough, it forms this really thin membrane, and you can see light passing through this thin membrane. So that's like the window pane element that you would get from this window pane. So you can kind of do that with this dough, and you can see that it does pass the window pane test. You can stretch it quite thin without it breaking. And so your dough has developed enough gluten, and it'll be able to support all of the gases that's going to form when you're fermenting this loaf. So after the first mix, you have your first proof or your bulk fermentation. So you just cover this dough and you'll let it proof for about 5 hours or so until it's doubled in size. I typically add a stretch and fold into the dough. I just pull the dough up with my hand and stretch it just to add a little bit more gluten in about an hour. But for the most part, the dough just sits there and rests for 5 hours and you don't have to do anything with it. Then I put the dough in the refrigerator overnight for up to 2 days. There's a couple of reasons to do an overnight proof, and this is pretty typical in most sourdough baking. Is one, it improves the flavor. So the dough will continue to ferment in the refrigerator, but at a very, very slow rate. And while it's fermenting at a slow rate, you'll build up so much more flavor because the starter and the yeast is just slowly eating away. And that's what are eating away at all the sugars from the flour and all the enriched ingredients. And that's what's building flavor in your dough. It's also easier to shape when it's cold. So especially for this brioche, it's really buttery and it'll be a little bit sticky on the countertop if you try to shape it warm. So when it's cold, it's a lot easier to shape. And then lastly, it allows you to bake on your own schedule. So you can put the dough overnight in the refrigerator and up to a couple of days. So then, you can have a flexible schedule depending on when you want to bake your bread.
If somebody, is trying to manage their schedule and they feel like they don't have the full number of hours that you recommend for that first proof, can they leave it in the fridge for an extended period? Or if you know that you're going to be leaving it in there for 2 days, would it be wise to shorten that first proof to kind of adjust it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, fermentation times are always kind of dependent on your schedule. And there's sometimes when I too have an issue with something, I'm like, oh no, I have to, throw this into the refrigerator really quick and come back to it later or something like that. So it is pretty flexible. I do tend to kind of like this process where it ferments at room temperature for the set amount of time. That allows it to just kind of get going, right? If you immediately put your dough into the refrigerator, your sourdough is just going to slow down. So this is not like, active dry yeast or baker's yeast where the yeast will continue to ferment very quickly, even in the refrigerator. Sourdough just kind of slows down and almost stops completely. So I know people do a bulk fermentation in the refrigerator, but in general, that's not recommended in sourdough baking for like very long extended times. It can also get a little bit more sour. So the longer it sets in the refrigerator, the more sour it's going to get. And for this brioche, I kind of think up to 2 days is kind of the max before it starts getting like a little bit too sour for my taste. So when you're ready to bake the next day or a couple of days later, you'll divide and shape your dough. So all of these gases have built up in your dough that's doubled in size. So I usually just use a fist, and this is like the fun part, just kind of punch the dough down. You'll weigh the dough as one mass together. Use your baking scale for that, and to divide it into 4 equal sized pieces. And then we'll shape the dough. So I have, let me get a little bit of flour here on my bench. So I have one of the pieces here. And this is just a quick way to shape this. It's really easy. It doesn't require any fancy technique like sourdough bread. And another reason why I really like making this brioche. So you just flour your countertop, and you'll just pat this dough into a rectangle. Let me get my camera. I usually do about 3 by 5 inches or so. You'll do this for all 4 pieces of the dough. It's in this kind of rectangle shape. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then use your hands to just lightly roll up the dough into a little round. There's a little bit of sticking here, which is totally fine, because once the dough starts proofing, it will ferment, and it will kind of even out in the pan. So your dough is in this cute little tube. Hopefully you can see that rolled up, and then you just place it bake straight into your baking pan with the other pieces. So I'll just set it right in there like that. And you'll continue with the other 4 pieces straight in a row. And that's how it will do your final proof for the shaping. So the shaping is really easy, and you don't have to shape it this way. This is the method that I like. I think I mentioned it earlier. You can shape it into rolls. So you could do you could probably get 8 rolls in here, and divide into 8 pieces. And then you'll have like 8 little balls that you could shape this dough into. Lastly is the final proof. So just cover your pan and place it in a warm location. It'll proof for about 5 hours again. If you notice it's sluggish, it may need to take longer. It's all dependent on the temperature that it's proofing at. So the warmer it is, the faster it's going to proof. You'll know when this dough is proofed when it has doubled in size. Usually in this pan, it comes, if you look at it at a straight angle, you'll see the tops of the bread right here. It might rise to about 1 inch below, but the very tops of the bread will kind of be visible here. And that's how you know when the dough is proofed. Another test that you can do for final proofing to know when your dough is proofed enough is to do what's called the finger poke test. So you just take a floured finger and you gently poke the dough. And this will tell you, how do you know how much more proofing that it needs. So if you poke it and there's a long indentation and it stays there, it probably needs to be baked pretty soon. That might be that it's overproofed. If the dough slowly springs back, then it's probably perfect. And then if the dough springs back immediately, if you poke it, then it's probably underproofed, and it has a lot more room and air that it can develop. So what you're looking for is just a slow indentation that gently raises back up. Okay, and then you bake your dough. So you preheat the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I have the Celsius 204 degrees Celsius there as well. I brush it with an egg wash with 1 egg and a splash of water and just a light brush on top. This will help the dough get shiny in the oven and give it this really nice brown color. You place it in the oven and then immediately turn down the temperature to 350 degrees and bake for 45 minutes until it's golden brown. So I preheat the oven at 400 degrees and then lower the temperature, because this dough, kind of like when you're making croissants or you're making sourdough bread, kind of it benefits from this initial blast of heat. And this just makes it poof up faster in the oven. So this dough gets really, really tall in the oven. It'll poof up really fast. But then because it is still a lot of dough, it needs a longer time to cook. So if you bake it at 400 degrees, it might get a little too brown on top and not be fully set in the middle. And it might be a little too doughy in the middle. So bake it at 350 for 45 minutes until it's golden brown. Then you can cool your bread and enjoy it. This bread keeps for a few days at room temperature wrapped up. So you can just wrap up the bread that way. Like I said, use the udine and it makes it last a little bit longer as well. It's shelf stable that way. And you can easily double the recipe. So this makes one loaf, but you're welcome to just double all of the ingredients and double the recipe that way. Here's the loaf once it's baked. It's so beautiful, very light. The whole kitchen smelled like butter when I baked this a little bit earlier. And here we'll show, let's break it apart and see if we can get some nice, I hope, yeah. Let's see if we can get some nice strands here. Oh yeah, look at that. Oh, so pretty.
Ooh,
Look at that, I know, yeah.
nice.
It's like, is my mouth watering? Yeah. Had a little bit of, it's normal for this to kind of happen where it kind of like has this hourglass shape. That's usually just, I may have like overproofed it just a little bit. But still it has this really beautiful strand, kind of pillowy texture that you can just pull apart like that. It's just really delicious, so yummy. And like I said, if you don't eat it all, it makes really great French toast, or you can use it as the base for other recipes like hamburger buns or cinnamon rolls, dinner rolls, that type of thing. All right, so let's get into the Q&A section here. There's a link to where you can find the full recipe on my website. There's my email as well, brandon@sourdoughbrandon.com. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And then of course, I'm on social media at Sourdough Brandon. I answer questions regularly on my Instagram page there. So feel free to message me or post a comment if you have any questions about this bread. And I'm constantly posting this brioche bread because it's so popular. It's one of the most popular recipes on my website.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's
Yeah.
a wonderful walkthrough, and we've got a number of questions.
Okay.
Before we dig into it, just a couple business things. I dropped the links that Brandon mentioned also in the chat. So go give him a follow on Instagram and go check out his website. Also, for everybody who's joined us today, if you're interested in any kind of Sourhouse tools to help your brioche baking process, we're going to provide everybody with a 10% coupon off of any products they buy over the next couple days. So I'm going to drop that in the chat as well, so you can make sure your starter is nice and active when you're getting ready to make it. But yeah, let's get into some questions. I know that a few things came up as we went along. The one earlier that came in was a question about rye flour. Can you use rye? I imagine thinking in both terms of the starter and the main dough. Rye has less gluten. How does that affect a brioche bread?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it for brioche bread, just like you said, Eric, like it doesn't have as much gluten development. So you'll notice most rye breads that are 100% rye are just really, really dense. They have so much flavor, but they don't develop gluten really well. So this dough kind of relies on the bread flour that's a high protein, high gluten bread flour to really rise that tall. And that's what makes it chewy, and it gives it that stringy pull apart texture. If you did want to add some rye flour, I mean, I would do like 5%. I would do a very, very low amount. That being said, I do add like dark rye flour to my sourdough starter often. I add just a few grams to my small sourdough starter because the yeast just really love the nutrients of a sourdough starter. And I think, so I have a sourdough starter tips page guide on my website. And that's one of my top tips is to add whole wheat flour or especially rye flour to your sourdough starter if it's a little sluggish. So keeping it at the right temperature obviously is going to help it, but adding a little bit of rye flour can really just boost your sourdough starter and make it, you'll just be like really, really happy that way.
And how would you think about mix-ins in general? So obviously you said this is the basis of the things like cinnamon rolls, cinnamon brioche obviously could be a thing in itself. People might want to put in some nuts or some other
like
kind
a
of
babka.
spices. Yeah. So like where in the process do those things get added in, and like what are the limitations? Like give people some handrails on like, how much and how not to go too far.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. It kind of depends on what ingredients you're using. Some things like cinnamon actually it slows down fermentation a little bit. So if you add cinnamon directly to the dough, it will kind of slow it down. Garlic can do the same thing, even to a bread. So when I do additions, I typically fold it in. Like I think in this case, like a babka would be a really good option for this bread. So braiding it and then rolling it in like cinnamon and sugar. So then it's not actually in the dough itself is just kind of like layered in, almost like I think of like I have like a cinnamon raisin bread recipe, and it's just a sandwich bread, but then it's rolled up like a cinnamon roll with a layer of cinnamon and brown sugar in the middle, and that way the cinnamon doesn't completely kind of go against the fermentation and affect the sourdough rise too much. I think there's lots of inclusions that you could add to this dough. I think it's best alone though, and I always say follow the recipe first, to a T, and then you can make adjustments and experiment. I'm all about experimenting. That's how I develop recipes all the time. And I add something, and sometimes it's like, nope, that did not work. That doesn't work. And then other times I add things, and it's surprising, what you can add to bread.
Awesome. And like, and just also thinking about other flours, we had a question come
Yeah.
in from somebody who has some what he describes as Italian technical flour. I'm imagining he's thinking of like double O or something like that,
Yeah. Yeah. That's
that he uses for panettone. Can that be used for brioche?
Yeah, it could definitely be used. I mean, the method, the window pane test, that's going to be the way to know if the dough is soupy, if it's greasy, or if you've been mixing it for so long and it's just not coming together. Add more flour to it. Check on those methods. Make sure your butter wasn't too warm. But I think you could use most flours here. I would add, if you wanted to leave in a little whole wheat, you could add that for a little bit more flavor. Um, I would keep that to like the 10 to 20% range, pretty low. Um, but you could definitely add other flours to it.
Need it. In general, high gluten, you need a lot of structure, hold up all that oil and so on.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's going on.
So somebody asked me that early on, can you use salted butter?
Oh yeah, I saw that. That's a really good question. So I think it kind of depends on the butter that you're using. So why bakers use unsalted butter is because every brand kind of adds a different amount of salt to salted butter, and some salted butters are really, really salty. It can add really great flavor to a bread. I think for this, if you use salted butter, it'll be quite savory. I think it would lean towards. So you definitely could just eliminate the salt from the recipe and just use the salted butter. But I always recommend baking with unsalted butter because then you can control actually how much salt is in your recipe.
Right. And then I guess it also brings up questions when we're talking about the dairy. If you want to make a vegan or just like a non-dairy version of
Yep.
this, which I'm lactose intolerant, so I've always attempted this, and I have vegan people in my family.
Yep.
What I found is, like oat milk is a perfectly fine replacement for
Totally.
dairy milk and adds maybe a little bit more sweetness. But the butters are very difficult to work with. They tend to be more
So
oily and not hold that room temperature kind of solidity that you talk about as well. Have you played with any like alternative dairy kind of in these recipes?
So I personally haven't, but I know someone commented on my post a few weeks ago, and she made this bread with like made it vegan with vegan butter. So I don't know what brand that she was using, but it must have been something that was a similar texture to like dairy butter.
Yeah.
So I know it's doable. Like I said, it's pretty flexible in some ways. I think making it gluten free would not be possible because it does need the gluten to kind of hold and support the loaf. But making it vegan, apparently you definitely can. And I think, yeah, like you said, oat milk or nut milk would totally be fine in this recipe. There's not that much whole milk anyways. It's about a quarter cup.
Yeah. I've used Earth Balance, which is a very typical butter that's available
Yeah.
in the United
Yeah. Yeah.
States. And yeah, I think that it's just that greasiness, getting that balance. Somebody actually asked, or is Jenny, so if the butter's too warm when mixed in and then you end up with a greasy dough, can you try to fix it by cooling down the dough at that stage?
Yeah, it's always harder to it's always harder to take things out than to add things in. So if the butter is warm or you're noticing that it's a little greasy, that's why one of the reasons I don't dump all of the butter in at the very beginning. You add it one slice at a time just to kind of slow down the process. Yeah, I mean, you could probably chill it a little bit and it might help. Um, I wouldn't do it too long though, because then the butter will kind of start breaking in the dough. So then when you start mixing, you'll get little like chunks of butter instead of like this type of silky texture that you're going for. But I know I mean, it probably is possible to do it that way too. Yeah.
Let's maybe dig into the hydration and oil relationship a little bit,
Yeah.
because that's something that I still don't feel like I have a great rule, kind of like rule of thumb around, but like I know that by in principle that um, adding oil to flour makes it more difficult for the water to get to it, and so this hydration, the process of hydrating the starches is more difficult or slower or something like that. I don't know how you best describe it. And so a lot of times with recipes like this, you do some sort of early mix of the liquid, the non-oil liquids and the flours first to start that hydration process. Have you found an advantage to letting that sit almost like you're doing like an autolyse or something like that
Yeah.
before mixing in butter? Does that change the dough at all?
Yeah, so that's also like the reason why I don't add the butter at the very beginning. I add all of the ingredients first, and then let it rest if it needs to. If you notice it's like really wet or shaggy, just let it rest for 10 minutes covered, just letting the like gluten kind of hydrate the flour, or letting the flour hydrate and also letting the gluten rest sometimes really benefits the dough. For something like this, always add the butter or the fat at the end. Um, I'm not a scientist, but yeah, fat does repel the water for the most part. Um, you know, Interesting you said that. So I released a like a tahini, black sesame paste sourdough this week, and I was very skeptical about that problem. I was like, tahini has sesame has a lot of it's a very high fat ingredient. And when I added it to a regular sourdough bread, I thought, this isn't going to mix at all. And at first, it kind of seems like that. It's like, ooh, this is kind of hard. This isn't incorporating in well. Like, how is this going to work? But what I did was I ended up kind of layering two doughs together. So one, just like one half of the dough is just a typical sourdough bread, and the other dough is this black tahini paste that has a little bit of honey for flavor and sweetness, to just kind of balance out the tahini sesame flavor. But it also has that high fat sesame paste to it, which seems odd. But then you laminate the dough in, lay it on top of each other, fold it together, and it works. And it comes out this like the really delicious dough. So I think, don't be scared about adding fats to your dough. I know some people add a little bit of olive oil even to their sourdough bread. That can give it a really nice crumb and soft texture to it. If you're dealing with like if your breads are always coming out really, really dry, well, you may be over baking it, but also, you could try adding a little bit of, say, olive oil to it and see if that works.
Yeah, yeah. I think I've even tried or heard of, there's like maybe an Italian version of this that is olive oil based. Um, it's like an olive oil brioche. And I'm not quite sure how you get around the
Yeah.
greasy. I think maybe when I tried it, I ended up kind of with a greasy dough, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing with this, but yeah. Um, the somebody else, Michelle, shared the Miyoko's butter is a good vegan butter that's cashew based.
Oh, yes. I've
That
seen
that
that.
a lot of people like, and it's fermented, which if you're a fan of fermented foods, which I'm sure we all are, you might enjoy that flavor profile. Um,
I'm
so
baking in a standard oven. I typically don't use convection because most people don't
yes,
use or
so
have convection ovens
Scott
here.
asked if the temperatures were a standard oven or a convection oven.
Yeah. I mean, you can do it in a convection oven, just lower the temperature by 25 degrees. That's usually pretty standard.
So, and then everybody's oven's different, so you probably kind of have
Yeah.
to get to know your oven with
Yeah, like
baking bread.
keep an oven thermo. That was like a huge tip that I was, especially with baking sourdoughs. Like you think you're preheating your oven to 500 degrees and it's only going up to 450 or something. Like keep a little oven, like a $5 oven thermometer in your oven. it makes all the difference because you have to adjust your oven depending on the brand, and every oven, like you said, is so different.
Totally.
And then of course elevation and all these other things
Yeah.
that you have to think about as well when you're baking, especially with sourdough.
Um, the so speaking of the oven setup, somebody's asking about a pizza stone. Is that useful, particularly in this bake, to help hold in the heat when baking?
Yeah, that may yeah, like the baking steel maybe. I mean, I don't have one. I'm not really super familiar with baking with it, but it would definitely retain heat. And I know one of my favorite authors, Erin Jean McDowell, she writes the Book of Pie is like a really great pastry pie book. And she recommends putting the baking steel at the bottom of the oven and just keeps it there all the time. So it just kind of keeps the oven regulated. Oven temperatures can, as it's preheating, can go up and down by 50 degrees sometimes. My oven's, you know, luckily it works pretty well. But if you are having that like fluctuation in temperature, if you put the thermometer in and you notice it going up and down a lot, then yeah, having the baking steel in there would definitely like help it, retain the heat.
Yeah, when you open the door, if you want to turn something
Yeah,
on,
yeah, anything
exactly.
like that.
Yeah. Okay, and then and we also, well, I had a question about the Udemy and similar type techniques, because that's like to me the crux. That and applying the enriched ingredients are kind of like the crux of a brioche, and the thing that you kind of take to other breads. And I made for Christmas some rolls that used a kind of a boiled flour technique. And one thing I read, at least in the Chinese method, is that sometimes that might be prepared and allowed to sit for a long period of time, like maybe like 12 hours or something like that,
Yeah,
to further hydrate and gelatinize those starches. Do you notice that difference if you let that uni sit for a period before you bake with it?
yeah. I typically make it at the same time that I make the levain, so about 5 hours before I start mixing the dough and let it set. It's almost like you mentioned a little bit earlier, almost like a little autolyse that you have with the dough, and so it just kind of lets it hydrate a little bit more. That being said, the doughs that I prepared here yesterday, I kind of I just wanted to make the dough a little faster, and as long as it was cooled down, it worked. So this udine here, I made an hour before the webinar started, and you can kind of see it's sticky. The flour seems hydrated. It's cooled down completely. So I think that might be for larger amounts of dough that it really needs to set for a very long time. And I have not noticed a difference. For Tingzhong, it has milk and you're doing it over a stovetop. So I think you have to be a little bit more careful about not scorching the dough. Whereas this is just flour and water and it's mixed together. It's a little easier to me.
And when you're incorporating that, obviously, is there any trick? Like if you're using a mixer, that's easy enough. But if you're trying to incorporate a material like that into your
Yeah.
dough by hand, do you have any, is there mixing tips or anything to make sure that it gets distributed well?
Yeah, I think the slap and fold technique. So I wish I had a dough that I could like show you that, but you just throw the dough onto the countertop on a flour countertop, and then like quickly with your hands just kind of bring it towards yourself, pick it up again, throw it at the counter. That kind of just force is like literally forcing the dough to kind of come into a shape and start that gluten development. It really accelerates the process. With other doughs, you can kind of knead it a little bit more gently for a certain amount of time. And I think if you're seeing that the udine isn't incorporating that way, you could definitely do a kneading motion. So just rocking back and forth with your hands and using the palm of your hands to kind of knead it in. It is just flour and water. So even though it's a little bit pasty, it does incorporate pretty well into the dough. And I would say it's a similar texture to that black tahini, black sesame dough that I was
Mhm.
mentioned the other day or a little earlier.
Yeah, the slap and fold, the most cathartic technique in sourdough baking.
Yes. If you have
Um,
anger issues, like make sourdough.
yeah, yeah. Um, so, for those of you who bake yeast breads, maybe not so familiar with sourdough, I think the mixing and the stretching and folding process, that's one of the places where things are a little different. You did mention punching down this dough, but that's less common sourdough baking. Jordan did ask if you're converting a recipe from a standard yeast leavened bread to
Yeah.
sourdough. Do you have any guidelines on how to
Yeah.
make that conversion?
Yeah. So typically it's like, I think it's 100 grams or 120 grams of sourdough starter equals like 1 packet of active dry yeast or instant yeast. So, I don't know exactly how many grams that is of instant yeast, but that's usually the conversion is like 100 grams of sourdough starter. And then because sourdough starter is equal amounts of flour and water, and it's just fermented, you do need to convert the recipe by lowering some of the flour in the recipe and some of the water or whatever liquid is used in the recipe.
And I would add to that, like the look up the term hydration or download the community cookbook and check out the hydration section there. Because once you understand that concept, you'll have a lot of flexibility in creating recipes and understanding kind of translation between yeast and sourdough, because
Yeah.
ultimately you don't have to use any particular amount of starter. It just, will change you can change your flavor profile and change the timeline for which it ferments. But a very typical ratio is something like 10 to 20% starter to the total volume of flour in a recipe, as like a starting point to kind of do an average recipe type bake. But people use very small amounts of starter, sometimes like 2% or 5%, and then let it sit for extended periods and let that very slow fermentation happen, and it still makes bread. It just changes the timeline and a little bit about how the flavors develop. So it's so you can do a 1-for-1 if you want to try to create a yeast recipe, but it's actually, the world is quite, there's a lot more flexibility and you can have a lot more fun with it. Also learn that like notion of hydration, sourdough hydration. Um, so I guess what's your favorite way to eat brioche? Like, are you a French toast person, or you just like it straight? Like you mentioned, like do you have particular topping? You do jelly? Like how do you like
Yeah,
your jelly?
I really like apricot strawberry jam on it. I think it's really, really delicious. It's really great alone. If you're into like a really decadent like sandwich, that's going to be really, really good. I think it's on my Instagram, maybe in my Instagram stories right now, but someone made like pulled pork sandwiches and used this recipe and made like hamburger buns out of it, for like the football games this weekend. And, it looked awesome. So you can use it in so many different ways. And I think it's really flexible. And that's why I, wanted to share this recipe with you all.
Totally. If you are tuning into this and you have a favorite way to enjoy your brioche, drop in the chat so we can all get some ideas. I guess last couple, we're getting here to the end. So just last question, so what should people just in generally look out for? Like when you get feedback from people about this recipe, where do they tend to go wrong or make mistakes like that people should be careful about when they're trying this for the first couple times?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the mixing. So like making sure that you're mixing it long enough. Test the dough that it has developed enough gluten. If it doesn't develop enough gluten, it just won't rise at all. You won't get that stringy kind of fluffy flavor that I was showing you all, or not flavor, fluffy texture that you'll get. I think the butter being at room temperature is a part of that as well. So that's just like a really important concept of making brioche in general, is that the butter is at the right temperature.
Cool. We got one more question, or a couple more. Generally, like how many hamburger buns do you think a recipe like this might make?
Yeah, this would probably make about, I would say like 10.
Okay. And when using a mixer, is it easier to use that flat blade or the dough hook during the initial mixing of the dough?
Yeah, you definitely want to use the bread dough hook, because that is what wraps around the dough. It's twisted in a certain way to wrap the dough and make sure that it evenly incorporates. If you just use the flat blade, it won't actually like develop gluten. It just kind of, that's more for just like mixing, say batter for a cake or cookies or something like that.
Right. Um, uh, I'm just responding here to. So I think that hits most of the questions. I'm just going to run through real quick, make sure we didn't miss anything. But yeah, I think we did it. So Brandon, thank you so much. That was so helpful, and I feel much more confident in my ability to go make some brioche, and I think I might do that this week.
Yeah, I'm excited to eat this one.
Yeah, totally. Um, uh, and I think that I would love it to see, if any of you end up making Brandon's brioche recipe, please do share it, on Instagram, and tag us both. We'd love to see what you create. And the yeah, and if you have any other questions, feel free to ping Brandon, and to reach out to us, and we're happy to help as much as we can. But thank you, Brandon, so much for sharing your knowledge.
So thank you all for having me. Like Eric said, I'm excited to see if you bake this. Just tag me on Instagram or comment on the post itself on my website. If you don't have Instagram, you can email me. Happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And yes, just to kind of wrap this up, the discount code is live. You can use it now. And there is a recording that we've made, and so far no technical problems. So we will likely, once we download it and do all that stuff, we'll share it in the next couple of days by email. And but thank you for all of you for joining us today. And we will have we're planning to do another webinar on a topic that is to be determined in a few weeks. So stay tuned to our newsletter and our Instagram feed, and we'll announce what we have coming up next. And we hope you'll come back and join us again. All right. Well, bye everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.